In 1860, the world population was approximately 1.2 billion people. 100 years later, in 1960, the population had nearly doubled and exceeded 3 billion people. In just a century's time, that number had nearly tripled, and it seemed to pretty much everybody that it was going to continue to grow at a breakneck pace. And there was growing concern that some kind of miracle was desperately needed, because if the population continued to grow at the current rate, many were beginning to believe that there was not going to be enough food to go around. And that prospect sent a lot of people into a panic. But those people began to panic because there was a few things they didn't know. See, those people, they didn't know that 100 years before the population hit 3 billion, a brilliant baby boy by the name of George was born as a slave on a little farm in the state of Missouri who was owned by a man by the name of Moses Carver. Now, George had hardly been born when raiders came tearing through the struggling little farm of Moses Carver and turned that farm and George's life and the Carvers' lives upside down. See, baby George's father had been killed prior to this raid in an accident, so his mom was all he had left. However, not only was the infant George kidnapped that night by the raiders, but his mother was never seen or heard from again after that. He was now not only kidnapped, but he was also an orphan. Now, most would have probably just written baby George off for dead at that point, but Moses Carver wasn't willing to make that decision. And so he worked tirelessly and sent out messages and was able to get in contact with those raiders who had come tearing through his farm, and he was able to arrange a meeting. And he traveled to meet those raiders, and he took the last horse he had on his farm with him. And he made an exchange, his last horse, and in return he was thrown a sack with a nearly dead baby boy inside of it. And Moses picked up the sack and he held baby George close, and he walked him back to the farm. But Moses knew that when they got back, George's mom was not going to be there waiting for him. And so Moses Carver and his wife Susan decided to raise George as their own son. And so a little boy named after one of our forefathers, George Washington, who was born as a slave, now became the son of a farmer. And he took that farmer's name, and he became George Washington Carver. And the Carvers, they cared for and they loved George, and they brought him up. They taught him even how to read. And when he was about 10 or 11 years old, they sent him off to school so his education could be furthered and he could continue to learn and grow. And when that chapter of his education was closed, he went on amazingly to college. And George Washington Carver, he arrived at Iowa State University, 1881. He was an outstanding student whose knowledge and interest, particularly in botany, was evident to all, not just to his peers, but also to his professors. And of course, he would famously go on to invent over 300 things that we still enjoy the benefits of today, most of them coming from the peanut, of course. But maybe the most important thing that George Washington Carver ever did was mentor a 6-year-old little boy who shared his love for botany. Over the years at the university, he became close with one of his professors, and this professor had a little boy by the name of Henry A. Wallace. Now, Henry was just 6, but nearly every weekend, George would spend time at the Wallace household, and he would take his little buddy, Henry, on botanical expeditions with his father's blessing. And because of all the time that Henry and George spent together, Henry looks back and he was truly shaped and molded by those Saturdays and Sunday afternoons that he spent with his friend George. In fact, they so shaped him that Henry Wallace went on to love botany, to love agriculture, and he devoted his life to the study of that field. And as a result, when Henry Wallace was grown, he was chosen to serve as the director of agriculture under Franklin Roosevelt from 1933 to 1940. And when Roosevelt was reelected again, Wallace was once again chosen to serve, but this time not as the director of agriculture, but as the vice president of the United States. His title changed, but his passion for agriculture and botany, it remained the same. And the time that he was named the vice president of the United States, the population was now creeping up towards 2.5 billion people, and concern was starting to creep up as well about where that number was heading because it was climbing so fast. And so shortly after becoming vice president, Wallace took a trip to Mexico as part of his diplomatic duties. And during that trip, he noticed that the crops on the farms in Mexico were in a terrible state of affairs. Disease and the hot, dry weather had just wreaked havoc specifically on the wheat and the corn crops. So much so that there wasn't enough food produced in Mexico to feed the population of Mexico. Wallace noticed that the hybrid varieties used in the United States of America for wheat and for corn, they produced much, much, much greater yields and had much greater disease resistance than what he was seeing in Mexico. And so he decided that he was going to try to leverage the power of his office to do something about the dire state of the food production in the country of Mexico. And so he came home and he got to work and began trying to raise support and convince donors to contribute to this agricultural research facility that he wanted to build in Mexico to try and create some of these hybrid varieties that would serve the people of Mexico well, that would agree with the hot, dry climate, that would resist the disease issues they were facing and struggling with, and that would produce much greater yields. And that sounded like a great idea to some folks, and so construction began, preparations were being made, and by 1943, just about everything was in place to begin the research. And then in 1944, a man by the name of Norman Borlaug was tapped and chosen to join that research team in Mexico. Norman, he was a brilliant scientist. He had a passion for agriculture. He had served as a microbiologist from 1942 to 44. Specifically, his job was to study and research issues regarding bacterial and fungal interactions with crops, and that background served him really well upon his arrival in Mexico. And so he began to work with local farmers and scientists to try and understand the problems they were facing and create solutions to fix those problems. And through his use of traditional plant breeding methods and hybridization methods, he quickly was able to eliminate the number one disease that was destroying the wheat harvest in particular. But even with that issue solved, the yield was still simply too small. And so Norman began to focus all of his efforts on creating varieties that would produce high yields. And that work was a bit of a process. But improvements were being made, and those improvements, even though they were in an imperfect state, did start to make a huge impact. When Norman arrived in Mexico in 1944, again, Mexico had to import food to feed the population. Hunger was a huge concern. The country was not self-sufficient with their current production. But by 1956, Mexico was self-sufficient. And in the years following that, they became an exporter to other countries. And 20 years after Norman Borlaug had arrived, corn production in Mexico had doubled. It was 2 times what it was when he got there, and the wheat production was 5 times what it was when he arrived. But that work didn't even just stay in Mexico. Now, there were countries and areas all over the world that were struggling with this same issue, specifically in places like Africa and the Middle East. And it turns out that those disease-resistant, high-yield varieties that Norman had founded in Mexico also served to solve the same problems in the places in the Middle East and Africa who were facing the same challenges and the same dire consequences. And interestingly, all these discoveries and Norman's work spreading across the world just happened to coincide and go hand in hand with these ever-rising concerns about the worldwide food shortage that they thought they were facing. In the 1960s, it was truly at a fever pitch. I mean, the population crossed that 3 billion mark, and panic was at an all-time high. Books like The Population Bomb were being written, and people were beginning to discuss theories about what populations, what countries, what peoples should they take out so that the rest of the world could avoid starvation. And at the time, all those people floating all those theories and writing all those books, well, they had no idea that a guy named Norman had unlocked the methods and the knowledge that was necessary to enable the world to feed billions more people. Now, I'm sure that there were lots of hungry and panicked people in Mexico and places all over the world that in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, they were praying to God, asking for a miracle. There were lots of people who believed that the only way out of this was if God were to open up the heavens and if he were to rain manna down just like he had for the Israelites in the wilderness. But instead of doing something miraculous, God protected the life of a baby boy who was born a slave. And that baby boy mentored a 6-year-old who became the vice president of the United States. And the vice president started a research facility and tapped a scientist named Norman, who took on that initiative and whose work saved billions from starvation. God had carefully moved the right pieces and the right people into the right places at the right time through a seemingly disconnected mix of good, bad, and neutral events over a century in order to be able to solve the world's biggest problem at just the right time. It's estimated that Norman Borlaug work is to thank for over 2 billion lives being saved, and that number goes up every single day. But his work is the culmination of a chain of events that was directed and orchestrated by the finger of God. And some people may say that they don't think that's true. Some people might say that it's just coincidence that Norman happened to come along at just the right time and happened to make these discoveries and unlock these new ways of growing crops and these new hybrid varieties. But I believe there is more than just coincidence at work in that story. As St. Thomas Aquinas, he's got this great quote. He says, "To one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible." You see, some people will say, well, just coincidence. But I don't know about you, but when I hear that story, looking back now, I can't help but see the finger of God at every twist and turn, carefully orchestrating the details and the events of the lives of those involved. It is so obvious to me. But the problem is that all the way from the 1860s, all the way through the 1960s, nobody could see the finger of God doing this work. And when you are facing starvation, it is hard to believe that God has not forgotten you if you can't see him working. I mean, just like in our lives, when we find ourselves backed into some sort of corner, or we're experiencing some kind of hardship, or we are suffering physically or emotionally, or whatever it may be, we tend to believe that if God isn't doing miracles for us in those moments, then God isn't doing anything at all. But that is not true. In fact, what's true is that God rarely works through miracles, but he often works through providential orchestration, or by what we will call the finger of God. Now, I'm sure that the people suffering with empty stomachs and facing the prospect of starvation, that they would have chosen a more miraculous deliverance. But God doesn't always work in the miraculous fashion that we think that he should. More often, his work goes unnoticed and unseen. And he does this sort of thing all the time in our lives in many different ways. And when he does his unseen work, we call that God's providence. When he orchestrates events from behind the scenes to accomplish his purposes. Now, I'm sure if you've been a believer for longer than just yesterday, that you can look back at your life now and you can see that there were periods in your life, there were moments in your life that God had moved the pieces and he had put you in just such a position, and he had providentially orchestrated the events and the details of your life so that you could be put in just such a spot for just such a moment, in whatever case it may be. You can see the finger of God at work in your life, providentially orchestrating the events and the happenings in your own life. But at the time, I would be willing to bet you had no idea that's what God was doing. You can only see that looking back. And that's because although we can look back and see it very easily, it is nearly impossible to see God doing his providential work in real time. Which leaves us with some decisions to make in terms of what we choose to believe and how we choose to live whenever God is silent and invisible in our lives. I mean, are we going to believe that God's silence equals his absence? Are we going to believe that? Are we going to believe that when we can't see him doing miracles, then he is not doing them at all? Or are we going to choose to believe that even when we can't see it, the unseen hand of God is working for our good and to accomplish his purposes? But for the next 5 weeks, as we move through the book of Esther together, we're going to see God orchestrating from behind the scenes to accomplish his purposes, not miraculously, but providentially in the lives of his people. And we're going to see how to be people of God who wait actively for the Lord whenever he is seemingly silent. And we are going to see how to do the next right thing, believing that God is doing something that we just can't see yet. Throughout the entire book of Esther, you're going to see that God never steps out of the shadows. God doesn't do any miracles. He's never even mentioned by name. But he's everywhere if you know where to look for him and if you have eyes to see. And that story begins in Esther chapter 1 with a king named Ahasuerus, a queen named Vashti, and a nobody named Esther. And that leads us to our first principle. Even when we can't see God working, we must trust that he is. Even when we cannot see God working, we do not know what he's doing, it is not visible to us, we must trust that he is in fact working. He is in fact doing something. Now, Esther's story doesn't actually begin with Esther. It begins in the palace of a Persian king named Ahasuerus, who is probably more commonly known as Xerxes. Now, that's the same guy. It's in fact the same name. It's just a different language. Xerxes is the Greek equivalent of Ahasuerus in Hebrew. So same name, same guy, just different languages. But we're going to pick up Esther chapter 1, and here's how the story begins, verses 1 through 3. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him. Now, if you go on reading, you will see that the king called all these guys together, these nobles, these officials, these governors, for what amounted to a 6-month-long soiree for these guys. And we do not get directly told in the passage exactly why it was that he did this, but because the Bible is not a made-up book of fairy tales, it records real events and real people that really happened, we can go back and we can piece together the clues and figure out what is very likely the context and what is happening here. I mean, we do know that this was only 3 years into Xerxes' reign, and we know that he took the throne right about 483 BC as the king of Persia. Now, at the time, the Persian Empire, it was a world superpower, but there was still lots of room for expansion and peoples they hadn't conquered. And for years now, the Persians had their eyes set to the west towards Greece. Now, about 10 years earlier, King Darius had tried to go conquer Greece, but he was embarrassingly crushed at the Battle of Marathon. And it seems that maybe now, perhaps Xerxes wants to avenge that defeat, and he wants to prove that he could do what his predecessor failed to do. And so he calls for all these governors and these officials, and he brings up the army, and he throws this 6-month-long party, because these governors and these 127 provinces, these nobles, they're going to be the people that have to supply the soldiers to fight this war. And so it seems that probably this party wasn't just a party for the sake of having a good time, but he was trying to rally support, he was trying to make plans, he was trying to prepare for the invasion of Greece. And so he is trying to show off how impressive he is and how great he is and how wonderful he is. And he's trying to show the fancy things and all of his wealth and his might. It says in verse 4 that he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days. And it says at the end of that 6 months of schmoozing and scheming and trying to convince these guys, it says that apparently he's got the result he wants, because he decrees one last great hurrah. He's going to throw a great party for 7 days for everybody in Susa. And he was going to host it in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And once again, he goes all out. He wants to put on a great show. He wants to impress everybody. And so it says that there are couches of gold and silver. There are marble pillars. There is wine, all that you could want, all that you could drink in golden cups for everyone to enjoy. And so after 7 good days of drinking all the wine you want out of golden cups and lounging around on golden couches, the king gets one last great idea to really put his party over the top. I mean, he's got all these guys together and all these important guys he's trying to impress. And so he's kind of hit them with the best you've got. He's given them great food. He has given them lots of alcohol, and he has tried to show off all the money he has. And so if you're trying to impress a bunch of degenerate guys, those are 3 pretty good ways to do it. But if you want the one last great way to do it, it is, of course, women. And so Xerxes says, I know, bring out the queen, bring out Queen Vashti. I've got a great idea. It says that he wanted to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So essentially, what Xerxes wants to do is he wants to show off how good-looking his wife is to a palace full of drunk guys. Maybe not the greatest plan ever. Wouldn't advise doing that. But apparently he thought that's exactly what he should do. And so he sends for the queen that this is what he wants to have happen. Now, we don't get any more details about exactly what his request was. However, it is pretty likely that he asked Queen Vashti to be less than appropriately dressed for this little stunt. And we know that because, first of all, it just seems to fall right in line with his character and the character of any pagan king at the time. Seems to fit the tone of the story, but we also get perhaps an even better clue in how Vashti responds. Because when she hears this request that she be brought out so that everybody can see how lovely she is to look at, she refuses to honor the king's request. And it is important to know that it is no small thing for her to refuse to do that. No small thing at all. She knew that there was going to be some sort of penalty, some sort of price to pay for refusing the king's request, because she was both denying the king and denying her husband. She was saying no, and she had no right to do that. She had no power, no authority to do that. And she knew that the king was not just going to go, oh, well, that's okay. That's all right. That's not that big a deal. She knew that she was going to have some price to pay for refusing to do this. But apparently, she thought that this was so far beneath her that she refused anyway, which indicates that she was probably being asked to do something that was degrading. And although we don't know very much about Vashti at all, apparently she had enough of a moral compass or enough of a sense of shame to say, I'm not doing that. But Xerxes, he didn't see it that way. In fact, he and all the others saw this as disobedience to the king and to her husband, and they couldn't have either one of those. And so they get together and they start discussing how are they going to deal with this, how are they going to respond, and it's somewhat amusing, actually, if you read it, because you get the idea that they say, look, we can't let this go unpunished, because if word gets out that the queen is refusing the king's request, if the queen is telling her husband no, if our wives hear about that and our women hear about that, then they're going to start telling us no, and we can't have that, and so this has to be punished. And so they decide that they've got to really bring the hammer down, and they decide that Vashti has to be banished for refusing this request, never to be heard from again. And so that is what Xerxes decides to do. Vashti is banished, and now the seat of Queen of Persia is empty. And with that piece of business sort of taken care of, Xerxes says, now I can finally get back on mission, the invasion of Greece. Now, just as before, the text doesn't explicitly tell us this is where the second Persian invasion of Greece took place, but the timing makes a lot of sense. It lines up perfectly here. Chapter 1 ends with the banishment of the queen. Chapter 2 begins with after these things, this phrase. And then there seems to be some sort of significant break in time, because it says that also not just after these things, but it says that the king's anger had abated, as in he wasn't angry about this whole episode with Vashti anymore. And it is pretty unlikely that Xerxes got over that in a weekend. It's pretty unlikely that that was a short amount of time. It seems that there's some sort of significant break happening there. And so it seems that after banishing Vashti, he heads off to lead his assault, his attack on Greece, which turns out to be a catastrophic failure. In fact, this invasion, this second Persian invasion of Greece, this is where the famous Battle of Thermopylae happens, where, the movie 300 and the 300 Spartans hold off 1,000,000 Persians, and, the arrows blot out the sun. And that's where that story, that legend, that's real events that really happen. And although the numbers may be exaggerated a little bit here and there, it's true that a seemingly or a comparatively tiny force of Spartans held off an enormous number of Persians. And the rest of that invasion kind of followed suit, and Xerxes is quickly defeated. He's put in his place, and he heads back home with his tail between his legs. And that's where chapter 2 picks up. He arrives home, and he comes in the front door of his palace, and he goes, "Oh, honey, I'm home, and I had a terrible few years at work, and I need a hug." And then he goes, "Where is that woman? Oh, that's right. I banished that woman. She is not here." And so, realizing that he has no queen, he decides that that's got to change. And so there's some guys around him that say, "Hey, we know how to find your new queen. We're going to search the whole empire, 127 provinces, and we're going to find the most beautiful young women that we can find, and we're going to round them up. We're going to put them through a year-long process of preparation, and then you're going to get to spend some time with them, and you pick your favorite, and that'll be your new queen." And Xerxes says, that sounds great to me, make it happen. And so all over the kingdom, this process begins of gathering up beautiful young ladies so that they can begin this preparation, so that they can go through and see if they can become the new Queen of Persia. And that is where Esther enters her own story. Now, up to this point in Esther's life, a lot has gone wrong for her. She is living in a foreign city because her people have been carried off from their homeland. And she is currently being raised by some kind of cousin or halfway distant relative named Mordecai because her parents were dead and she was an orphan. Life had been happening to Esther, and most of it has not been good. The one thing that she's got going for her, she is a beautiful young woman, but even now that's seemingly going to work against her because as the king's servants are searching the kingdom, they find her and they say, you're just what we're looking for. And so she is taken in. And if you're thinking that that seems like maybe not such a bad thing, that seems like a good turn of events for her because, what a compliment, first of all. But two, now she's going to get to live in the palace. I'm not so sure that Esther thought this was a great thing. If there was any hope in her heart for ever returning to her homeland, that was now gone. The harem was going to be her home. And Mordecai may not have been her father, but he was the only family that she had, and now she was being taken from him. Not to mention the fact that living in the harem of a pagan king is not exactly the things that dreams are made of for a young Jewish woman like Esther. But despite this not being the way Esther had planned her life going, she decides to put her best foot forward, and she very quickly makes a big impression on pretty much everybody around her. There was a man by the name of Haggai who was in charge of all these new young women. And he was so impressed with Esther that it says that he advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. And so after this year-long preparation process, and Esther's time has finally arrived to go spend time with the king and meet him. And the king, when he meets Esther, is just as astonished with her as everybody else has been up to this point. We read in verse 17 of chapter 2, it says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, I think if you're looking for a good turn of events, this is probably the first good turn of events for Esther in the story. But yet, even this may not be quite as wonderful as it sounds like it could be, because even as queen, Esther's not going to have much say in anything. She's not going to have a bunch of power. She's not going to have a bunch of influence. She's not really going to have much control over anything in her life still, even as the Queen of Persia. The previous queen, Vashti, had just got banished for saying no to the king, and Esther knew that if she did anything like Vashti did, or she did something the king didn't approve of, or that she said no, that she was going to face the same fate. However, if you're going to be in the harem, you might as well be queen. And so Esther is. And you might notice that Esther is now queen through the course of the most unlikely, seemingly disconnected, bizarre string of events that you could possibly imagine. Firstly, the seat of queen is vacated because Vashti chooses to do something that many would have not had the courage to do. Then Xerxes goes off to war, gets embarrassed, comes home ready to fill the seat, but instead of filling the seat by going to what was, I'm sure, probably already a well-established harem, or by choosing to, marry to strengthen alliances, marry some daughter of some other king or prince or ruler or governor or whatever, which is almost always how it went these days. Instead of doing those things, he decides to hold what most people, when they're talking about the story of Esther, they call it the Miss Persia contest. And then they hold the Miss Persia contest, and the incredible irony is that the Miss Persia contest is won by a Jew named Esther. Esther is not Persian, and yet she won the Miss Persia contest. And she is made the Queen of Persia, even though she is a Hebrew. She is a Jew. And so there's this very long string of events that they probably shouldn't have happened. The seat of queen should have probably never been open in the first place. Xerxes probably should have been successful in his invasion of Greece. He had superior numbers. All of these things probably should not have happened. She should not have won a Miss Persia contest as a Jew, and yet she does. But you might notice as well that God seems to be nowhere to be found at this point in Esther's story. I mean, he's never mentioned in where was God whenever her parents died? Why didn't he miraculously save the lives of her parents so that she didn't have to live as an orphan with Mordecai? Or where was God whenever all these young women are being rounded up and they're being, brought out and they're choosing and picking? Why didn't God preserve her and protect her in that moment so that she wasn't taken away from Mordecai? I mean, where is God, and why is he just letting life happen to Esther, whether it be for the better or for the worse? Well, I don't know about you, but when I consider that Esther was a foreigner who was a nobody, she was an orphan, she had no connections, no political standing, no standing in society, nothing. All of a sudden, she is now the Queen of Persia. I tend to think that God has his fingerprints all over that. I mean, they searched 127 provinces. They searched an empire for the most stunning and impressive young ladies they could find, and Esther is chosen as the best of the best. God elevated perhaps maybe the most unexpected of people without doing anything overtly miraculous at all. He carefully guided and positioned the right people in the right places at the right time, and because he had done that, a God-fearing Jewish woman was now the Queen of Persia. And I hope that that story alone is encouraging to you. I hope that you can see, looking back, that how God had orchestrated and God was in every twist and turn of the story, the good, the bad, and the neutral. He may not have done any miracles. I mean, he could have. He could have shown up to Xerxes in a dream or vision of some kind, and he could have seen Esther clear as day, and God could have said, Xerxes, that's your new queen. You've got to go get her. You've got to find her and make her the queen. But God didn't do that. Instead, God made Esther beautiful. God used Vashti's courage to open the seat of queen. God put her in a position to be noticed by the king's servants when they're looking for young women. God gives her favor in the sight of the king's servants, and God gives her favor with the king. That is the finger of God, plain as day, in Esther's life. But I am not so sure that Esther would have told you in those moments that she could see God using the events and the circumstances of her life to one day make her the queen. Now, the text doesn't say this, so this is speculation on my part. But I wonder if Esther often wondered where God was and why he wasn't intervening. Because it is certainly safe to say that her life had not gone according to her plan. I don't know what her plan was, but I'm pretty sure this wasn't it. And it's safe to say that she had more than one opportunity. She had plenty to turn her back on God for abandoning her, because it seemed like he was nowhere to be found. And I think many of us would have probably believed that and would have done that. But Esther did not, because she believed that God was not absent. He was just silent. He was working in the shadows and in the unseen. She did not believe that God had forgotten her or neglected her. And so she did not turn her back on God in anger and frustration. I would imagine that most of us, we probably feel like we live most of our lives wondering where God is. I mean, sure, there's moments in our lives where you can look back and you say, oh man, that's just as plain as day. God was working miracles. God was moving mountains. I mean, that's just easy to see how God was all over that time in my life and all over those moments in my life. But most of the time, that's not the way it goes, is it? Most of the time, God doesn't do miracles. Most of the time, he works in the unseen, which is why you and I have to believe and trust that he's working even when we cannot see it. In Deuteronomy 31:6, God says he's not going to leave us. He's not going to forsake us. Jesus says in Matthew 28:10 that I am with you always. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with those promises. But the question is, do we just know those promises, or do we believe them? Do you really believe that God is working for your good and for his glory, even when you can't see him? When life keeps taking twists and it keeps taking turns that you didn't plan for, do you start looking around for God to intervene? And when he doesn't show up the way you want him to, do you start to think that he's forgotten you and he's abandoned you? Or do you trust that he is providentially working to accomplish his purposes in your life? What do you really believe? And if you're not sure what you really believe, whenever you find yourself in those moments where life is out of your control, it's taking twists and turns, things are not going well, you're under pressure, whatever it may be, do you turn on God or do you turn to him? That's a pretty quick test to figure out which side of the fence you fall on. Do you take matters into your own hands and try to control your way out of the spots you don't like in your life? Or do you trust that the finger of God is working in unseen ways and just do the next right thing for the right reason while you actively wait for God to finish what he started? Any kind of suffering or pain or inconvenience in our lives, it reveals to us what we really believe about God pretty quickly. It will show us whether we negatively interpret God's seemingly silent action sometimes for his abandonment, or whether we trust his character and his promises. But for some of us, we may not struggle so much to trust that God is provident and that he's working faithfully, but instead we might struggle to believe that God could use someone like us. Someone who is screwed up as many times as we have, someone who still struggles like we struggle. I mean, maybe you believe that God does put the right people in the right places at the right time, but you have a hard time believing that you are ever the right person for the job. Well, that leads us to this final principle. God's providence in our lives is not predicated on our perfection. His providence is not predicated on our perfection. You know, Esther's character, it is admirable, and her example of how to live and handle the silence of God in your life when it doesn't go like you planned, it is outstanding. But just like everybody else, Esther was not perfect. I mean, she didn't have any say in the fate of her parents. She didn't have any say in being exiled in Susa. She didn't have any say in being rounded up into the king's harem. However, if you look at somebody like Daniel, for instance, and how him and his friends handled themselves in similar circumstances when they were brought into the king's palace, you see a pretty big distinction in how Esther handled it and Daniel handled it. You see, Daniel decided that he was unwilling to compromise on anything for any reason. He refused to eat the food from the king's table. He says, I am not doing this. I am not transgressing or approaching transgressing the laws of my God. You can punish me however you would like, but I believe God's going to honor my faithfulness. That's what Daniel did. And I'm by no means saying that Esther was a coward. I'm not accusing her of being somebody who lacks character or having some sort of moral decay issue. That is not what I'm saying. However, we have no record of Esther proudly proclaiming her allegiance to the one true God and rejecting the customs and the norms and the requests that were likely placed on her and made of her as part of this year-long process and in being the queen. In fact, we know that she intentionally concealed her true heritage, and she seemed pretty concerned with keeping her identity, her heritage, and her faith something to not be found out. And she seemed willing enough to go along with the king's plans all the way up to the end, which included spending a night with all of these young women trying to find his new queen. When we read in chapter 2, verses 14, that a night with the king was the culmination of this year-long preparation process all of these young women went through. It says, in 14, it says, in the evening she would go in, that being Esther and these other young women, they would each have their turn. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return. Now you can fill in the blanks, but that's a pretty sleazy arrangement. However, if it's any comfort to you, all of these women were becoming concubines, all right? They were not a long string of one-night stands for the king, and that was true for Esther as well. So it wasn't a long string of, one-night stands with no commitment. However, it's definitely not ideal. Do not do this. This is not, God is not prescribing this as a great thing to do, all right? But it's not as bad as it could have been. However, this is an opportunity, again, for Esther to maybe stand up and say, I'm not going along with this. I'm refusing to be part of this. I am a Jew. I am not doing this. I am just not going to be part of it. But she doesn't do that. She doesn't refuse to take part in all of this. She doesn't appear to call out the sin around her. Her goal very much seems to be to fly as under the radar as possible in terms of her religion and her heritage. And I think that there is a really strong case to be made that in those decisions to try and fly under the radar, she was exercising wisdom. And there's no indication that God was displeased with her or that she directly disobeyed any specific commands. But it also seems to be true that she didn't possess the courage and the convictions of somebody like Daniel. Now, I'm not prepared to say that Esther, again, directly disobeyed any specific commands, but I do think it is very, very, very likely that she had to make some compromises here and there along the way in order to maintain her cover and avoid being found out as a Jew. But even though that might be true, And even though there might be spots where you could say, oh, well, Daniel would have done it better here, or this person would have done it better there, God still chose her to be queen. Correct? I mean, God still chose her. God still orchestrated the events of her life and the happenings around her to make her queen. God did not toss her to the side because she didn't have as much courage as Daniel did, or because she didn't have the same convictions as Daniel. And that's very encouraging to me, because I know that I lack a whole lot more than Esther did. I mean, I know for sure that I don't have the courage of Daniel. I know for sure that there are people recorded in Scripture and other people around the world all the time that I fall very, very short of. I don't have the same virtues that they do. And I know that I have transgressed the commands of God in my life, and I struggle with sin. I know that I come up short and that I am not perfect. And it is good to know that God's providence is not predicated on my or your perfection. It is good to know that God does His perfect work through imperfect people. And I know that I am guilty sometimes of believing that because I don't have the same courage as somebody else, or because, I am not perfect, that I now take myself out of the usable pool of people that God could position and put in the right place at the right time. I think that I have disqualified myself from ever being the right guy for the job. But based on Esther's example, that just simply isn't true. I mean, can your mistakes set you back? Yes, absolutely. Can your sins and your struggles sometime disqualify you from being in certain positions? Yes, absolutely. But your lack of perfection and coming up short of that, does that mean that you are completely unusable to God? No, absolutely not. That is not what that means. And I am not trying to downplay the seriousness of sin or the need for us to stay in step with the Father. But it's really good to know that God's providential orchestration of my life doesn't depend on me being perfect. However, me maximizing my impact and me seeing God clearly whenever He's maybe not apparent to all and He's not performing miracles, it does depend on me being what Jesus calls pure in heart. You see, Esther's entire story is one where God remains hidden to the casual observer. But there are a group of people who can look at the story and see God everywhere. And they're the group of people that Jesus talks about in Matthew 5:8 when He says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Now, if you want to see God in the waiting, you've got to have a pure heart. And what I mean by that is if you negatively interpret God's unseen and silent work for His neglect and His absence, then you are not going to see God working because you have chosen to believe that He isn't. And so you are not going to see it. But if you have got a pure heart, if you trust His promises, if you trust His character, then you're going to get some clues along the way. I mean, I doubt it was lost on Esther, the unlikeliness of her rise to the throne. I doubt it was lost on Mordecai either. I'm willing to bet that that was a clue to Esther, that she may not have known what God was doing, but when she became queen, I would have to believe that there was some part of her that said, God must be doing something because I shouldn't be here. God must be doing something because this probably shouldn't have happened. That was a clue for her. And the same is true for us in our lives. If you want to see God when it's not obvious, and you want to see the clues He leaves along the way, then you must be pure in heart and trust His character and His promises. And so be encouraged that God's going to leave you clues. Be encouraged that God's plans are not hinging on your perfection. Sin's serious. We must war against it. We must repent. But our weaknesses and our shortcomings in possessing certain virtues or making certain mistakes, they don't make it impossible for God to position us and to use us. I mean, maybe you don't feel like you're the right person, but let God make that decision. Don't you take yourself out of the race. Don't you take yourself out of the pool and say, well, God can't use me. I don't have enough courage. I don't have enough virtue. I make too many mistakes. Our job is not to figure that out. Our job is to war against the sin in our lives, and our job is to trust that God will put us where He means to put us. And so we work on being pure in heart. We work on warring against the sin of our lives, and we trust God. We don't jump ahead of Him. We don't become impatient with Him and say, I can't see what you're doing, so I think you've abandoned me, and so I'm going to do it myself. We don't try to control our way out of the parts of our lives we want to change. We are pure in heart, and we are patient, and we are faithful. We do the next right thing for the right reason, trusting that God is doing something that we can't see. And we are going to have to make that commitment over and over again. We are going to have to answer this question over and over again, the question of the next time that you think you need a miracle from God and he's not doing it, are you going to choose to believe that he has abandoned you and forgotten you, or are you going to choose to believe that he is working, his unseen hand is moving, the finger of God is doing something? And so my challenge to you is to genuinely evaluate your heart, to be honest with yourselves about whether you really trust God's character, whether you really trust God's promises, even when he's silent in your life. And if you find yourself realizing that maybe you would not have done so well in Esther's shoes, then repent of that mistake, confess that, and make a commitment to not just know the promises, but to believe them and settle the truth deep down in your heart that God's silence does not equal God's absence, and that he has not abandoned you, but that he is always working for your good and his glory.